There used to be water, in the unending sea. Not slip of clothing, hands scrabbling quick and frantic to sort through the filth and waste. Here was a colorful bottle, its label long since burned pale before the sun went cold, the residue of whatever contents had clustered around its nozzle decayed into fine powder millennia ago. But perhaps, if she was lucky, somewhere deep within. She began tearing at it, a sharpened bit of metal and her crooked teeth gouging at a surface that discolored and crackled beneath them, the familiar sour taste of plastic coating her dry tongue. After a moment a crack opened like a pained mouth, and she scrabbled at it with long, broken fingernails, prizing it open, breaking it apart. But whatever had been in that bottle once was gone now, and left nothing but hard eggshell plastic behind. There was no energy to spare on lamenting. Already her hands were digging down, shoving aside bottles and bags and boxes and tires and scraps of old cloth. Already she was shoveling the husk-dry trash aside like sand, diving into it like water, seeking something else, anything else, that might have once been edible. Her hands were thin and yellow and weathered, shaking things like scraps in the wind that pawed and dug and scoured almost of their own free will. Her breath was thin and shallow, a calculated rhythm that pulled what little oxygen there was out of the corrupted yellow air, the burning of her lungs a necessary pain that had long since faded out of her consciousness. The goggles that had clung to her eyes since birth had formed a tight trench in her skull, so deeply ingrained that they felt like a part of her, an added organ that she couldn't have removed even if she wanted to. One of the lenses had shattered long ago, and beneath it her eye had been reduced to nothing but a little blind scar, burned and withered and sealed shut by the acrid air. Forward through the plastic she dug, the sticky cloth wrapped around her feet serving only partly to protect them. A cartoon smile beckoned from the filth, and she pounced on it hungrily, digging out a faded food wrapper, the eyes of whatever mascot it had once borne torn away and lost. Greedily, her tongue licked out, rasping against the pale underside of the thing, the thin worn wax paper tearing at even that slight pressure. But the food it had once held was gone, eaten away by time long before her shriveled, rumbling stomach had even been conceived. There was nothing here, the mariner decided. Nothing that could be left for her. Shuddering, she stood, the tremors that racked her body worsening as she trusted her weight to bones instead of plastic. Her hands shook so bad that she could barely control them as she reached up behind her, untying the rough twine that wrapped around her body and taking down the long, decaying traveling stilts that it had held in place, gently sliding one foot and then the other into the straps. One had been made of an ancient metal signpost, perforated and lightweight, a kink in its length forcing her to hold her leg at an awkward angle as she used it. The other was formed of some kind of black plastic, a foot longer than its counterpart, the tiny colored lights along its length still blinking sometimes, sporadically, as though trying to cling to life. She carried one in each hand as well, one formed of a pair of golf clubs bound in wire, the other a delicate fiberglass thing that stung against her skin, so that when she finally hauled herself upright with pained, jolting shudders, she adopted a strange, quadrupedal form, tall and aloof from the plastic sea. One long step, her bones aching and crying out in response. Another, the stilts crunching and grinding against the waist they landed on, and another, until at last she found the rhythm of it and settled into an awkward, pointed gait. It was hardly comfortable, but it was faster than crawling through the muck, and the cadence of it meant that it was easier to breathe. Sometimes, as she stumbled and picked her way across the expanse of grime, she wondered if this was how people had moved across the sea, in the faraway time when it had been water. Sometimes, as she moved like this, she found bigger pieces of what had been left behind. A neon sign, perhaps, the colorful lights crawling around its exterior gone dark, a few illegible letters, all that remained of the message it once bore. The hulk of a car, more rust than metal now, a single staring headlight shining its lonely beam out across the eternal hazy twilight. A mass of books, fused by time and acid rain into a single mass of pulp and paper, covers with pictures of landscapes or laughing children half visible occasionally within the hardened ooze. A radio tower on the distant horizon, old wires dangling like ivy, the beacon at its peak calling eternally to speakers that it would never find again. She had even seen a ship, once, looming half-seen through the yellow-white mist. Its hull had towered like a shadowed continent up into the sky, its smokestacks great spires that broke up its silhouette like battlements. Its paint had been just barely visible from this distance, white and red and iron gray, no more than tiny variations like layers in rock, their scale the only thing that protected them from being worn away altogether. A part of her had wanted to go to it, to search this colossal, ancient thing, to dig its secrets out like the center of a fatberg and feed her mind upon them. But there would be no food, in that ancient wreck. Nothing at all, except echoing, hollow emptiness. And time not spent searching for food was always time wasted. Quite suddenly, shattering her thoughts like an ancient jar, she felt a sizzling, burning pain on her exposed arm. Almost before she knew what was happening, she had dropped to the ground, frantically pulling the stilts off her feet. Another pain, and another, as little hissing plops began to sound on the waves of trash around her. It was the thing she lived in fear of, the single most terrifying threat out here on the plastic waves. Acid rain. There was no time to bind the stilts back onto herself. The acid was already starting to eat through her tattered shawl, little burning droplets pattering against her flesh. She would have to find them again, after the rain, and hope that they were still usable when the storm ended. Hastily, like a fleeing rat, she filled her lungs with sulfur air and burrowed down like a diver into the depths below her. It was dark down there, beneath the surface, the only light faint and discolored as it filtered down through layer on layer of translucent plastic. The air was rank and foul, though different from the burning miasma up above, a wet stench of rot filtering up from the depths of things contained. Too long without air or light. Down through those things she pushed, arms shoving them aside to give her room to crawl, until at last she lay buried entirely in an artificial tomb, and the hissing spatter of the rain echoed against the trash above her. But she could not stay still for long. The shelter of the depths was callous and fickle, and soon enough the rain would join her down here, beginning its own endless, eternal descent through the decomposing sea. And so downwards she pushed, half swimming through the mass of plastic rot and debris, hoping desperately that she could escape from that burning, yellow-white fluid that trickled down behind her. She hated it down there, within the ocean itself, where the trash pressed close against her skin and the suffocating airlessness made her head swirl. The filth was wet and eternal, never enough food to eat or water to drink, only the temptation of them beckoning her ever downwards, ever deeper. Smaller things started to gather here, cigarette butts and Q-tips and plastic spoons and bottle caps, coins like tiny stones and the broken heads of dolls peering out like fish from among the garbage bags, all of it filtering ever downwards towards whatever waited below. With them came other things, little and sharp and rotting away. Shards of glass that pounced like dead insects, their razor heads burrowing into her skin and spilling far more blood than she could afford. Needles and razor blades that carried poison in their bites, rust and sickness that made her head swirl and her good eye cloud. Bright liquids that burned to the touch, that looked and smelled like water but lied, and made her spasm and vomit to drink them. The worst of it had filtered away from the surface, but down here they sank still, finding their eternal road through the cracks and gaps as the filth around them was compressed ever tighter by the unbearable weight from above. But the dead, as cruel and sharp as they were not what she feared down here in the trash. For they were dead, and they understood it. They did not cling to life that fled their grip like grains of sand, or claw at anything that might be able to provide them one more fleeting moment. There was a sound, from somewhere deep below. It was a colossal sound, subtle and vast, like an earth tremor far away below. It was a sound of something moving, something so big and so hungry and so desperate that even the mere suggestion of it made her recoil and flinch against the layers of bottles that dug into her back. It was a sound of forgotten times, when movement meant life and hunger meant food, when existence could be sustained on more than fear and denial and hoarded memories. She felt her empty stomach twist, as she held herself perfectly, utterly still. Beneath her, she felt the water bottles and plastic bags push up into her gut, as whatever moved beneath her slid them up above itself in its wake. A breath, tiny and shuddering, far from sufficient, but all she dared. Another. A third. Ever so gently, she felt something dry and papery brush her fingers, like a hand reaching out from the sea of refuse, a hand of another mariner like herself, desperate for help or asking to be followed, down below. As delicately as she could, she pulled her fingers away. She thought there was a sorrow in the sounds from beneath, as whatever moved down there carried itself away through the dead corpse sea. But perhaps it was only her imagination, assigning thought to that which only survived because it dared not die. Shuddering, the mariner pushed herself upwards through the endless miles of plastic, dragging herself close enough to the surface to hear the pounding of the rain. The hitchhiker stood firm on the side of the poorly kept desert road, his left thumb stuck up at an almost unnatural angle. In his other hand, he held a piece of cardboard that had Phoenix written crudely in black Sharpie. Behind him, a mile away if not more, was the town of Las Vegas, the neon lights from the town barely visible from where the hitchhiker was stationed. As he patiently waited, the hitchhiker tried to think of how he had ended up here, why he would have ever wanted to go to a place that somehow would make him poorer, but his mind drew a blank. He realized he would never get anywhere if he kept being this impulsive, but it felt as if something kept stopping him, like he was under a spell that made him forget his promise over and over again. The sun beat down on him, dyeing his skin a pinkish hue. The hitchhiker was a lanky man, his weight nowhere near what it should have been for his height. He only had one pair of clothes, a t-shirt and jeans with black tennis shoes that were caked in a light film of dirt that wouldn't come off, no matter how hard the hitchhiker tried. He also wore a backpack, a small gray one that could barely hold his few possessions. He had his wallet, now empty of any money, save for maybe a quarter or two. A shell necklace he had found near a dumpster was also shoved in. Finally, the hitchhiker had a pair of blue sunglasses, that he only wore sparingly, so that it wouldn't be ruined like everything else. It was the only thing he had held on to from his old life, the only thing that showed that there was maybe hope he could be whole again. He had been out there for over 2 hours, silently waiting for someone to pick him up. He wasn't worried, however. Shirt. He also wore a straw hat that covered his bald head. "So, why you want to go to Phoenix?" the trucker said, his voice thick with a southern accent. The hitchhiker gestured to himself, made an X with his arms, then pointed at his mouth. It took the trucker a moment to comprehend what the hitchhiker meant. "Got it, you're a mute," the trucker said upon realizing this. The hitchhiker wasn't, but he just easier to say that. It was sometimes easier to just be quiet. The trucker pulled back into the road and got back to driving. The trucker and the hitchhiker were in the truck in complete silence for nearly 2 hours, with nothing but the faint sound of the radio to disperse the silence. It was night now, but there were no clouds and the moon was bright, so it wasn't very dark. The clock said 10 as they pulled into a gas station. "Looks like we need some gas. Do you want to get anything at the store?" the trucker asked. The hitchhiker shook his head and showed his empty wallet. "Well, that ain't a problem, partner," the trucker responded and held out a $20 bill. The hitchhiker immediately beamed up. No one had ever given him money for nothing before. He nodded and took the money. "Just make sure to give me the spare change," the trucker said, as he stepped outside and went to the pump. As the trucker filled up the truck with gas, the hitchhiker walked into the store. He grabbed a large bottle of Pepsi, a Lay's barbecue bag, and 2 packets of peppermint gum. The cashier rang everything up, giving the hitchhiker back change, $12 exactly. The hitchhiker looked at the money. It wasn't very much, but it would help. In a moment of desperation, the hitchhiker walked to the back of the store and put the money into his wallet, which he put into his pocket. He walked out of the store, trying to act confident, and got back in the truck. "Let me just go to the bathroom," he said and walked into the store. A few minutes later, the trucker came back out of the store and sat in the driver's seat. "No change," the trucker said, and the hitchhiker shook his head. The trucker nodded silently and went back onto the road. They continued their silence, until the trucker pulled off of the road, onto a rough dirt and sand trail. "There's a shortcut here to miss the traffic," the trucker said to the hitchhiker. They drove on the bumpy trail for several miles, and since they couldn't go very fast without damaging the truck, it took a while. It was long past midnight by the time the trucker pulled off onto a shack. The shack was small, only about 10 by 20 feet, and was made of sheet metal. The already rough trail went rougher to the side of the shack, before disappearing almost completely. A few lonely shrubs decorated the surrounding of the trail and the shack. The hitchhiker looked at the trucker in confusion, and the trucker responded, "I just need to get something from here quickly. Sorry for not telling you before, but this is a shortcut, overall." The trucker went behind the shack. For several minutes, the hitchhiker sat in silence in the truck. He started to doze off a bit, and he was about to fall asleep when he suddenly heard a shrill voice. "You gotta take a look at this, partner," the trucker screamed. The hitchhiker groaned and got out of the car and began to walk toward the back of the shack. He shivered, the temperature had dropped severely, and he could see his breath. He felt uneasy about the whole situation for a moment but pushed it deep down. He got to the back and saw the trucker standing over a large hole, next to a large mound of dirt and sand. "You gotta see what's in the hole here. Come on," the trucker said, as he held out his hand to beckon the hitchhiker closer. The hitchhiker approached the trucker and looked into the hole. In the hole, there was nothing except for something that looked like a wooden frame at the bottom. Confused, he looked closer, and he felt something touch his back. The hitchhiker looked behind him and saw the trucker standing over him, his hands on the hitchhiker's back. Before the hitchhiker could react, the trucker pushed him, and he fell into the hole and got knocked out. When he came to, the hitchhiker was in complete pain. He was face down in the wooden frame, which he realized was a coffin. He turned up and saw the trucker standing on top of the hole. His previous generosity and hospitality were completely gone from his face, replaced by red-hot anger. "By the way, you dropped your wallet," the trucker yelled, throwing the hitchhiker's wallet down into the hole, landing square on the hitchhiker's forehead. "You know, I almost thought you was different. I almost thought I wouldn't have to do this. But I was wrong. All of you bums are the same. Y'all are all just thieving liars." The hitchhiker grew desperate now. "Please, you don't have to do T-dash," the hitchhiker said, forgetting about his apparent muteness before he was cut off by the trucker. "You're not a mute either. You're even worse than the others. Now I don't feel too bad about doing this. Goodbye, you dirty bum," the trucker laughed as he grabbed two things from the side. He saw. It was a shovel and a large wooden plank. A coffin lid, the hitchhiker realized. He tried to get up, but the pain was overwhelming. Even so, the hole was far too deep for him to be able to climb out. The hitchhiker could only watch as the lid slammed on top of his head and as dirt and sand slammed on top of it. Before long, it was over. And the hitchhiker was alone in the dark. He tried to scream for help, but he knew that no one could hear him. He did it anyways until his voice was hoarse and he had trouble breathing. It wasn't very long after that when everything ended. Once it was done and the hitchhiker was buried, the trucker stood over the grave, to make sure the hitchhiker didn't do anything. When he listened closely, he could hear the cries of the hitchhiker, before they eventually dissipated into nothingness. The trucker smiled. What a pathetic loser, he thought. He waited a few minutes after that, then got back into his truck. He drove back onto the road and drove in a random direction. Soon, he found another hitchhiker, his sign saying Reno this time. The trucker stopped next to the hitchhiker and honked his horn. Maybe this one will be different, the trucker thought. Maybe. He never wanted to do any of this. He didn't want to kill. But he knew that it was what he had to do. He knew that he wouldn't be content until all of them were gone. Until the world would be finally cleansed. How long had we driven for? A few hours. The large abundance of trees in the area signaled that we were close to Mescalero, New Mexico. Recently, my brother, Michael and I were checking out rituals online due to lack of better things to do. Eventually, we stumbled upon one called Luck in Mescalero, a ritual that could result in millions of dollars, good luck, a wish being granted, and all that jazz. At first I laughed it off, but Michael insisted that we go due to Mescalero being within driving distance. This was when I really began to consider the whole ordeal. Everything could go right. It was too tempting to refuse. It took me, 5 hours to finally drive the car to the gas station and prepare it for the next day ahead. Today was the day. The sun was slowly setting on the horizon, creating a beautiful image to look at. Our materials were in the back seat, and the source of the entire ritual had been copied onto paper. Lining the sides of the roads were advertisements and directions towards the Inn of the Mountain Gods, our direct location. It wasn't long before I turned the car towards the road to the hotel. We crossed through mountains before finally chancing upon the beautiful lake. "That's gorgeous," Michael said. "You can say that again," I replied. We parked our car inside of the parking lot, which was already full and crowded with multiple cars, just to exit and walk back up the hill towards the check-in area. We entered the hotel, materials in hand. To our left, the casino. To our right, Broken Arrow. And in front of us, the giant fountain pouring water, already filled with coins. I walked towards the fountain. Michael followed behind. The first staircase leading to the fountain separated into 2 other stairways down to ground floor, but I didn't need to use them. I turned towards Michael and said, "What's my cue?" He handed me the coin and sealed it in my right palm. I slipped the coin within my fingers, feeling its metallic surface. "Do you remember the words?" Michael asked me. I thought for a second. "Yeah." I closed my eyes and began to speak. "Luck has shone upon me today. Whatever luck has to offer for me, I kindly ask that it currently present itself in its purest form. Take me to the place where the sky shines blue and the water is emerald green. If there is a risk I need to take, I will take it." I tried to be fancy with throwing the coin. I flipped it with my thumb and heard it plop in the water. All of the lights turned off. I heard Michael scream in horror, then shout a pained, "Ow," following a loud slam on the upper staircase. Then, everything went black, not much different from the earlier darkness, but still just as shocking. The ritual had begun. When I opened my eyes, I looked around. "Michael!" I screamed. "Where are you?" "Right here," he replied frantically. Sure enough, the sky was blue outside and the water in the glimmering lake was green. There was no one in the hotel besides us, very different from earlier. No sign of life. All was still. We had 1 hour to survive here. The only thing I was oblivious to is to what would happen within that hour. "Let's walk across the hotel." "Don't worry, I have the lantern." "If we're going to want to live, we're going to live now," Michael said. I nodded. Who knew what would happen? We ascended up the staircase. The fake fireplace was turned off, Broken Arrow was devoid of life, and it took me too long to notice that the fountain had stopped running, nor were there any coins nor water in there. It chilled me. We walked down the aisles. Still, there was nothing. No one. We walked towards the casino, which was much of the same still nothing. We walked down, passing the inactive fountain. It had been around 10 minutes into our hour when we finally sat on the fountain's rim and gave up with exploring. Suddenly, the water outside began to rumble. The emerald color of the water faded into a deep muggy green. Before we knew it, the entire hotel was shaking. Much to the shock of Michael and I, small goblins started coming out of the lake, increasingly growing bigger by the second. "Run," Michael mumbled. "Run." We ran up the staircase, tripping all the way. It was too late, for the goblins had already teleported inside and were charging straight for us. We ran towards the elevators, frantically pushed buttons, and waited until we arrived at an acceptable floor. Hopefully, the goblins wouldn't. I opened my eyes again to find myself in the lobby, next to Michael, the same exact place where we were before. To my surprise, there was no evidence that the goblins had even existed. They had simply been wiped out. Nothing was destroyed. Suddenly, the rumbling started again. Giant waves lashed at the window. "Oh, no, no, no," Michael mumbled. "This is just like catching fire, where different things happen each given time." My heart sunk. Literally. A wave came crashing towards us, breaking the glass, sending sea spray onto our faces and dampening strands of my hair. "Stay back," I yelled. "Just stay back." We remained close to the window for the duration of the time. Finally, after one more massive wave, it was over. When we filed into the lobby, the destruction had again disappeared. We waited there for the next disaster to happen, but nothing did. "Huh," Michael said. "Maybe it's broken." We were walking towards the casino when I felt something shift underneath my foot, like a pressure plate of some sort. As soon as I heard the noise, I saw a needle flying through the air. It pierced me in my arm. "Ouch!" I cried in pain. Blood stained my sweater and trickled down my arm, making me blush. "So, there's needles now," I gasped. "Let's be careful." We cautiously walked through the casino. When Michael touched one of the slot machines, I heard him yelp out in agony. One had pierced his back. As we walked, we got hurt more, one to my leg, another to my arm, and one to my nose. As for Michael, there were multiple needles. He was in clear, searing pain. "Thank God we've only got a half hour left," Michael sighed. "That means we only have to survive 2 more things," I said. "Let's continue on." "And then it's the finale," Michael replied. "How will we make it out alive?" I shrugged. The 4th round would be starting soon, anyway. Of course, there was the rumbling that I had grown numb to. But what happened next was something that none of us had been expecting. Giant bricks fell onto the ground, almost falling at random. It was almost like hail. Thank the Lord that none of the bricks had fallen onto us from the start, but we began rushing through the hotel, trying to find a secure shelter from the bricks. One of the bricks fell onto my back, weighing me down to the ground as I groaned in pain. Michael helped me onto my feet. However, my biggest concern was not of the bricks, nor of the pain, but of the finale. This time, when the round was over, a horn erupted. As soon as it ended, we were both holding knives. This was going to be big. Michael held up his lantern. We walked around until the area's presence became cold. So cold that I couldn't move. Michael shone his lantern, and suddenly the area warmed up again. And that was the moment that undescribable creatures appeared, screaming. They had no eyes, a large nose, and a disfigured tongue. The creatures leapt onto us, gnashing and screaming. One of them left a mark on my face, but I swung my knife and killed it. Smaller ones tried to knock me over, but I kicked them off and stabbed them. Michael did the same with a trick of his own by slashing his knife and killing a row of them efficiently. Suddenly, a big one was coming for us. It was the biggest monster I never hoped to lay eyes on. It had purely white pupils, a bigger nose, and a large mouth. No way. With a scream, I threw my knife at the creature's heart just as it aimed a needle at me. We were both pushed back, and I saw Michael looming over me with worry. He dropped his knife onto the ground next to me. "We are worthy," he screamed. We were being returned. The lights turned off, then went back on swiftly. When I was finally able to stand, I looked at Michael. "We did it!" I shouted. Michael and I hugged each other tightly. "Wait a minute, what was our gift?" I asked. "Let's find out later," he replied. "I'm just so glad you're safe." We kept hugging for a minute more before heading to the casino. I rushed to play one of the slots, sat down, and saw what my score would be. When my eyes caught sight of the screen, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Jackpot. My gift was good luck.